And the book of Esther, when we get into it, is a really tough book to talk about. In fact, it is one of the toughest books for pastors to talk about. I've looked at various different commentaries in studying for this series. Karen H. Job's probably one of the more famous commentaries for this series. You have Landon Dowden, you have Watkins, there's several others. There's a series from Timothy Keller that really influenced the series, and even specifically last week and this week. But there's a big challenge to this book, and there's a reason why. But our first point, if you're taking notes, I would encourage you to do so if you can, is this: just because you can't see God working doesn't mean He's not. The reason why this book is so challenging to deal with, both as a pastor and theologically, is because nowhere in the entire book of Esther is God mentioned. Nowhere. Not in any way. There's no prayer. There's no prophet. There's no prophecy. There's no dream. There's no miracle. There's no mention of God anywhere. There's nothing. In fact, it actually seems that the author goes out of their way to avoid mentioning anything of God. Now, we don't really know who the author is. Historically, Josephus, one of the historians of this time, they've always said that the author was perhaps Mordecai, which was Esther's surrogate father, because he would have had the education, he would have had the bird's eye view of the situation, but we don't really know. What we do know is it seems like the author is avoiding talking about God in the situation, but it's not by accident. It's not like he forgets to talk about God. See, the reason we know that it seems like he's avoiding it is because when they talk about, when Mordecai finds out that basically the Jews are going to get killed, all of them are going to be wiped out in the entire empire, they tear their clothes, they wear sackcloth, and they put on ashes. During this time in this culture, when you did that, you were fasting and praying, and they avoid saying anything about praying. So you can't write about sackcloth and ashes without talking about prayer. Even when Esther goes to say, finally, first she doesn't want to do anything about it, but finally when she does do something about it, she goes, go and fast, but does not mention praying. So the author seems to really be avoiding it. It's not like they forget God. It's more of actually that it's making a point. It seems like the author is making a point. He's highlighting here because the Jews have been in trouble in the past. We look back in when they're in slavery in Egypt, and God showed up. But in that situation, He showed up in miraculous ways, the plagues, turning water into blood and having locusts and all the different things where death of the firstborn. I mean, it was majorly supernatural deliverance. Yet in this situation, God would bring about deliverance, but it was not so obvious. There was not an obvious miracle or dream. But what we do see is a string of coincidences that had they not occurred, the Jews would have died. See, the point of Esther is this: God is in control whether we see it or not. Because what's going on is often in cultures, we look at the surface and we don't really see what God is doing. See, in Egypt, there were supernatural situations, but in other situations, like the book of Esther, God's at work in mighty ways that we would not actually perceive. See, we often want that magnificent, but God also works in the mundane. We want the big fireworks. God works in the everyday things. What that means is that God is at work in your life, and we probably don't even see when He's doing it. See, in this situation, if there wasn't a whole series of coincidences, all the Jews would have died. If the king never got drunk, the Jews would have died. Because he got drunk, got rid of Vashti. Had Esther not been beautiful, we're talking about a lot of women in the entire empire, so there must have been something completely different about her, and if she was not beautiful, she never would have been in position to help save her people. If there wouldn't have been wise counsel that was really dumb counsel and was really immoral counsel to get rid of Vashti and bring in all of these virgins, Esther would have never been in position to save her people. What we consider coincidences is what we would also call the providence of God. See, this is one of the main reasons we need to pray for our leaders. It doesn't matter if it's your parents or whether it be your boss, whether it be our political leaders. We need to pray for our leaders. Why? Because God can use and bring about His will with our leaders, even in their flaws and their mistakes. So we often want to point out whenever they drop the ball and whenever they fail, and sometimes when they drop the ball and when they fail, it may not even be true. It may just be propaganda. Sometimes it's true. But God can actually even use their failures. Think about this. Do you ever think about, we think about Moses. He listened to the burning bush and he went in. We want to ignore the point where he's like, it's not me. I'm going to ignore that. We talk about David killing Goliath and how amazing that is. We talk about Esther going, if I perish, I perish, while ignoring all the stuff leading up to it. Do you ever think about, God used the drunk king to bring about and save His people? God uses even our flaws, despite ourselves, to bring about His purposes. So we need to ask ourselves this question. When we can't see God working, doesn't matter if it's in your finances, in your relationships, whether your marriage is struggling or you want to be married, or in your health, or in our political system, or in the world. The question is this: when we don't see God working, what's more likely? Is it more likely God's not really working, or is it more likely we're not seeing correctly?